Abol Froushan. I come to you not just as a researcher in AI, but as a poet, translator, and a sort of long-term explorer of the space where logic meets imagination. I've had a career that moved across domains of enterprise architecture, AI strategy, and poetic inquiry. So this presentation is part of a larger series of research and reflections that I call AI and Poetics. It's a trilogy of books and ideas that explores poetic ontology, epistemology, and ethics in the age of intelligent machines. So today I wanted to ask a question that has haunted me for years. Can we measure the unmeasurable? Can poetic resonance, the way a line of verse makes your breath catch, be modeled? What you see today is a mathematical framework that doesn't aim to replace poetry with numbers, but to illuminate its depth, right? It's sort of, especially as AI begins to write poems of its own. So the motivation behind this particular paper measuring poetic intensity grew out of this deeper question about, can we create a rigorous, repeatable way of engaging with the experience of poetry without diminishing its soul? And what does that reveal about AI's creative limitations and our human advantage? The framework sits at the intersection of engineering and poetic depth. It's the synthesis of the work I've developed over the years, both as a system architect and as a literary thinker. So poetry has often been considered beyond analysis, something intuitive, ineffable. But if we could trace its what if we could trace its movements? What if we could model the emotional pulse of a poem, the structure of it, the imaginative elements of it, each as a dimension in a kind of conceptual space? That's the promise of the Poetic Intensity Framework. That I first introduced it in my AI and Poetics series. It's a framework that offers 15 dimensions across which poetry can be perceived, interpreted, and compared. Not to reduce the poem, but to engage with it a bit more deeply. As both an architect and a poet, I see this not as a contradiction, but as a sort of synthesis. So the model is to allow us to explore where AI succeeds, where it fails, and where the human imagination still holds the upper hand. So let's look briefly at prior work. Earlier AI poetry relied on rule-based systems or probabilistic text generation. Think of Markov chains, for instance. Later, transformers like GPT-3 and GPT-4 introduced stylistic coherence, but metrics like blue or rouge and perplexity are there, very helpful for translation and summarization measures, but they don't capture poetic alchemy or temporal distortion or emotional resonance of a literary piece of work. Recent efforts like BERT score or poetic transformer evaluation also begin to address style and novelty, but they still struggle with interpretability and with depth. What we're proposing here is what's missing as a framework that's grounded equally in literary theory and computational logic. Most mathematical models treat language as linear, but poetry distorts time, it splits meanings, and often performs emotional sleights of hand. This is why traditional NLP fails. Our network tries to introduce dimensions like ambiguity, creative will, and temporal distortion that bring us closer to poetry's lived intensity. So here's a kind of an introduction to the Poetic Intensity Framework, which evaluates poetry across 15 dimensions that are grouped into 3 domains: aesthetic form, cognitive depth, affective resonance. Now, these are not abstract metrics. they're grounded in literary theory, poetic practice, and philosophical inquiry. Think of them metaphorically as members of a theatrical cast. Emotional intensity might be the lead actor commanding the stage. Sonic quality sets the mood like a sound designer shaping resonance on the stage. And creative will directs the arc, choosing structure, metaphor, and tension. In the meantime, ambiguity and cultural resonance, for instance, as other players operate from the margins, subtly but very vital. A poem doesn't succeed by elevating one performer alone. It succeeds when the entire cast is in a kind of dynamic balance where every role contributes to the whole. That's what the framework tries to capture, not just poetic elements, but their interplay, the choreography of meaning, emotion, and surprise. So here's a kind of a full cast of dimensions. Each is a specialized performer, if you like. Creative imagination and poetic alchemy, they assess novelty, metaphor, and transformation. Narrative integrity and sonic quality kind of speak to form and rhythm. Others, like ambiguity or cultural resonance and temporal distortion, they deepen the poem's interpretive field. They're not arbitrary selections. Each is inspired by poetic exemplars, such as Eliot's fragmentation that anchors unpredictability, or Emily Dickinson's metaphysical compression that informs autonomy. Blake's prophetic vision sort of speaks of creative will. This kind of framework allows us to move beyond the vague impressions to map what we feel in great poetry with both rigor and reverence, if you like. So it's really to not so much to reduce poetry to numbers, but to make the resonance more legible, dimensional, and sort of open for discussion. So what happens when we apply this framework to AI versus human poetry? In our study, we compared poems by Rainer Maria Rilke, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, and others against these against poems that are generated by GPT-4, Claude, and Gemini. And the results were quite telling. AI poems often perform well on structure, phonetic flow, and surface level coherence. They're fluent, syntactically competent, and rhythmically kind of polished. But where they stumble is not in syntax, it is in the stagecraft, if you like. AI often assembles the set, even casts the roles, but it misses the emotive inflection, the embodied presence, the kind of interpretive energy that a human poet brings. In terms of scoring, AI outputs lag significantly in dimensions like poetic alchemy or emotional intensity or unpredictability, what we might call the core markers of poetic transcendence, as it were. AI can generate the script, if you like, but it cannot direct the play. That creative direction, the shaping of the will, the entanglements of ambiguity, or the commitments to form and feeling, they remain human acts, really. So here's a snapshot comparison. One of our test poems, Reflections in a Digital River, was generated by GPT-4. We compared it to Rilke's Evening, a work layered with sort of ontological tension and lyrical ambiguity. On the surface, the AI poem performs very well. It's coherent, stylistically fluid, and rhythmically smooth. It scores well on dimensions like sonic quality and narrative integrity. But its metaphors remain familiar, its imagery predictable, emotional resonance, arguably the soul of the poem, was very weak, scoring just 3 compared to Rilke's 10. So the overall poetic intensity was 61.7 for GPT-4 versus 95.3% for Relke. This wasn't really an anomaly. We kind of observed this pattern consistently across other AI models as well. And crucially, these differences aren't just technical, they're ontological. There's another paper I'm writing about how we should really train models on sort of ontology sets of data sets rather than pure linear text. AI poems kind of exist in what we might call a kind of probabilistic haze, and they remain sort of suspended in a field of potential meaning without having that sort of power of what we might call kind of interpretive collapse, the moment when a poem becomes meaningfully real in the mind of the reader. This concept is at the heart of the sort of quantum interpretation theory of poetry, which basically says the poem doesn't possess intensity as a fixed attribute. It becomes intense when it collapses into the presence or through interpretation, through emotion, through lived experience. That collapse is what AI so far can't seem to deliver. Yeah, the data set included works from both classical and contemporary poets, Eliot, Wong, Limon, as well as AI-generated poems tailored to their styles. We used controlled prompts to elicit kind of high-quality AI outputs and applied the framework, PIMF, blindly without annotations, without annotators knowing the source. We also examine how often interpretive ambiguity correlates with poetic intensity. Poems that preserve a kind of quantum coherence, if you like, tend to score higher over multiple readings, and this coherence is something AI hasn't yet learned to preserve. When we break down AI-generated poetry, a pattern kind of emerges. Where does AI excel? It produces smooth, structured verse. It scores highly in sonic quality, rhythmic fluency, phonetic balance, metrical precision. It maintains a good sort of narrative tempo, a clear thematic structure and logical flow. But where it fails is it sort of lacks the depth of layered metaphors or symbolic transformations, what might be called poetic alchemy, that sort of measure number 4 that is often weak. It cannot truly bend time poetically. Human poets tend to twist and fracture and reconfigure time and perception of time. That's less often the case with AI. Emotional resonance remains rather shallow. You'd say emotional intensity scores are low across all AI models. And what it tells us is really that human poets can disrupt expectations. They can break syntax, they can distort meaning and create the kind of unexpected. AI, on the other hand, basically mimics surfaces, but doesn't embody that interiority. It can imitate, but it doesn't really initiate, because it lacks kind of lived experience, the intuitive grasp of loss or existential angst, if you like, or contradictions. It lacks those. So it may be able to write a poem that sounds poetic, but what it can't do is what makes poetry matter is the act of breaking, bending, and transcending the structures. So, this is really one of the reasons that this framework is to bring new tools to the space of critical dialogue. As I've been editor of Poetry International, for instance, or poet in residence for BBC. I've worked with to foreground poetry as a space, not so much as a sort of escape from thinking, but as a mode of knowledge, actually. And this paper and the broader body of work that it belongs to offers a sort of counterpoint to reductive models of AI creativity. I believe that poetry helps us resist automation, not by opposing it, but by revealing what machines can't reach yet. We basically model each poem as a vector across 15 dimensions. The overall intensity score is the Euclidean norm of the vector, which is then normalized. It allows us to sort of plot poems in a kind of poetic hyperspace, if you like, a 15-dimensional space, and directly compare their expressive signatures, if you like. It's, you know, if you think of the Euclidean norm here as the sort of energy of the performance of the poem, each dimension scores a sort of presence, like an actor's projection on a stage, and the resulting intensity isn't just a number, it's a sort of indicator of embodied poetic energy, a pulse through all the vectors of the being of the poem. So from that point of view, poetic intensity isn't just confined to poetry. We've already begun applying the poetic intensity measurement framework to paintings, to screenwriting, even to music, because intensity isn't about a single genre. It's a mode of being. Whether the medium is sound or brushwork or even code, poetic intensity reveals how deeply a work moves us. And in a way, this research is sort of more autobiographical, if anything. It comes from my dual identity as an architect of digital systems and as a translator of poetry and writer of poetry. I've spent years designing computational frameworks and also breaking language apart to find what is irresistible and cannot be easily contained. So poetic intensity is not just a measurement, it's a gesture towards what is most human in us. And while AI might one day simulate that gesture, it cannot really feel it. It won't will it into being, if you like. And that's what this research ultimately aims to show, not just how to measure poetry, but how to map the limits of machine creativity, and in doing so, kind of affirm the enduring power of human poetic presence. Framework isn't just a tool for critique, it's a bridge from analysis to creation, from machine to meaning. It sort of aims to honor ambiguity, reward excess, and maps not just the content of a poem, but its event horizon, if you like, the threshold where meaning begins to emerge. AI has made stunning progress in generating poetry, but poetic intensity remains rather elusive. This framework really aims to demonstrate that while machines can structure and stylize, they still struggle with presence, surprise, and soul. The Poetic Intensity Framework offers a richer way to evaluate poetry, bridging computation and creative insight. Future work really includes integrating it with multimodal AI, combining verse with music, image, and speech to push AI's creative frontiers. You know, it's the inverse way of using it is to sort of get recommendation from AI about how to increase the score in a certain dimension if it's too low. So you can actually use it as a way of getting prompts to improve the intensity of the work at hand. So it really can become part of that mechanism by which we can work closely with AI as a way of enhancing our own creativity. As the previous paper, Peter Liu was saying, you know, the AI is lost without us, but we can actually build a lot more with the help of it. So finally, wanted to thank you for listening, and ultimately to say that poetry reveals what it means to be human, not because it speaks perfectly, but because it sort of resonates with us. And AI can amplify this journey, not just replace us, but to enhance how we can work with our own creativity. So feel free to connect with me through email or on LinkedIn. You can also read some of these ideas on my recent essays on Medium.